Pew 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 pew. I already did that. Today there's not much to say, we're just going to add the possibility to cast spell during the combat and kill the other units. So let's get to it. So in Unreal, the first thing we're going to start with is the widget during the combat. So we're going to add the spell bar in the widget that is visible during the combat, so we are able to select which spell we want to cast. So I'm going to go in my blueprints, core in combat, and open folder widget, and open w_combat. Inside that widget, I will add my spell bar at the bottom of my overlay. So I have my overlay right here, and I'm pasting my spell bar right here, which is a button list underscore spell that we created in the previous videos. So here it is at the bottom of my overlay. So I have my spell bar at the bottom of the screen, and I'm not gonna do anything to it. I'm just going to leave it as is, and around it I've set my border, the same border that I have for all my other widget components. So perfect, now we can compile, save, and close the widget combat. And now the next step is to make sure that the spell bar only contains the spells that are castable by the selected unit. So to do that, we're gonna link them both together. We're gonna link the unit and the spell bar. That way the spell bar is going to react depending on the statistic of the unit and the spell that are castable and things like that. So what we're going to do is link them together, and we're going to do that inside the player action. So I'm going to open the BP player action, and we're also going to need a new function inside the spell bar to link it with the unit. So I'm going to go in my spells right here and open the widget button list underscore spell, and in here I'm going to go in the graph and create the new function we're going to use. I named it link unit to spells list, and I'm passing it the unit as input, so a BP unit right here. And for now we're going to keep the logic of the function pretty simple just to make sure that the flow works. So I'm just going to set the spell list using the available spell of our unit. And now we just have to go call this function inside the player action every time there's a new unit that starts to play to link the unit with the spell bar. So I'm gonna go in the player action, in the function on unit turn started. So at the beginning of the turn of the unit, we're simply going to call the link unit to spell list function, passing it the selected unit. And they are now linked together. So at the beginning of the turn, the spell bar is going to display the right spells. Perfect. And now we just have to also unlink them because they are still linked and they are going to be linked forever unless we are unlinking them, and we're gonna do that at the end of the turn. So in the ununit turn ended, we're gonna unlink the spell bar with the selected unit. So I'm just going to relink the unit to spells list, but I'm not going to feed it anything, so it's going to link it to nothing, which should unlink them. Right now if we go test it, we're gonna see a few errors, but don't worry about them, we're gonna fix them a little bit later, but we can still go see how it looks in game. And that's how it looks in game. So at the bottom of the screen we can see both spells that are associated with the selected unit, and if I end my turn we can see that those spells get refreshed based on the selected unit. So it seems to work properly. Good. But there's just one little thing to fix. Right now the first spell in my spell bar is always selected by default. So if I select a new unit, we can see that the first spell is always selected, and that's not good. We want to only select spell when the user asks to select a spell. We don't want to select a spell by default. So we're just going to go fix that real quick before asking the unit to cast the spells. So I'm gonna stop and go back in the button list spells. And here, when I call my set spells list function, I'm going to pass it a new input telling it if we want to select the first spell or not when we are generating the list. So to do that, I'm just going to add myself a new input in the function. It's going to be a boolean, and I'm going to name it select the first spell. And I'm also going to make sure to check the default value. So the default value is going to be true because everywhere else in the code right now assumes that this function is going to select the first spell by default. So that's why I'm just leaving it to true by default, so it doesn't break anything. But in this case right here, I don't want to select the first spell, so I'm going to uncheck that condition. Perfect, now we can go inside the function to use that new variable. And we're simply going to use it at the end. So I'm going to go at the end right here. This is where we are selecting the first button. So I'm just going to, before the do once, do a little branch right here based on my new variable. So if we want to select the first spell, we're going to select the first spell. Otherwise, we're not going to. And now we're ready to select the spell when the player clicks on the button. So to do that, we're going to go back in the BP player action, and we're going to hook ourselves to the callback that is called every time the player clicks on one of the buttons that is in the spell bar. So to do that, to connect to the callback, I'm gonna go when we are creating the widget. So inside the onCombatStarted function right here, at the end we are creating the widget combat and adding it to the screen. And after that, we're just going to hook ourselves to the callback. So in the widget combat, we'll take the buttonless spells and we connect ourselves to the unselected spell button changed. And here in the create event, I'm going to create a matching function, which I'm gonna rename real quick unselected spell changed. And now we're going to get notified every time the player clicks on one of the buttons. And now what do we want to do with this information? Well, when the player clicks on one of the buttons, it's going to pretty much change the way it's going to play the game. Because right now, the player is in a state where he can move units on the grid. So when he moves his mouse over one of the tiles on the grid, it displays the path, it displays the reachable and things like that. But in the case that we want to cast a spell, it's not going to display the same thing. We're going to display the range of the spell and the AoE and things like that. So instead of leaving the player in the move unit state, which is the action CBT move, we're going to change its action to be, let's say, action CBT cast spell instead. That way, the state of the game is going to change from moving a unit to casting a spell, and we're going to be able to change everything that we want to change in the game. So I'm going to go back in entry to create that new action. So in core player action, I'm going to create a new child blueprint class of BP action and rename it action underscore CBT cast spell. And I'm going to move that action inside the combat folder. And then inside the combat folder, I'm just going to open the action. And for now, we're not going to change too much in this. We're just going to create ourselves a new variable and a new function. I named the function setSpell and I'm passing the spell that I want to set as input, so a new input variable of type eSpell, and I'm taking that variable and setting my variable that I have in my blueprint, so my spell variable that is in the blueprint, I'm setting it using the input we just received, so that way we have a way to set which spell we want to cast. Perfect, now we're just going to go call this function inside the player action, so let's go back in there, and when we are clicking on a new button, it's going to call this new callback, so the unselected spell button changed, and here, what do we want to do? Well, right now the player is in a state that he can move the unit, so we're just going to change the states to the action CBT cast spell. So let's do that. The first thing I'm going to do is to make sure that the button is valid, because it's possible that the player select and unselect the button. If he unselected the button, we're not gonna say okay, cast a spell, because you don't have a button selected. So that's why we have to check here if it is valid, and if it is valid, well, then we're gonna set okay, now you can cast a spell. So set the selected action to action underscore CBT underscore cast spell. Perfect, now the player can cast a spell. But in the case that the button is not valid, we're simply going to bring him back to the move action. So let's do that right here. I'm gonna set the selected action back to action CBT move. And in this case, I'm just going to make sure that the selected action is not currently CBT move. It's not already CBT move, because it's possible that the player tried to select a spell that is not selectable. Let's say if the unit doesn't have enough action point or things like that. We're not going to select the spell for real. The select is going to fail and it's going to return an invalid button right here. So that's why if we are already in the move action, we're not going to reset the move action. That will not make sense. So let's just do nothing in that case. Perfect. So now if we are selecting a valid button, we're going to cast a spell. And the last step we have to do is to tell it which spell we want to cast. So it's simple. We just have to take the left click action, because we just set the new action to the action cast spell. We can cast it to action cast spell. That way we have access to the set spell function and we can feed it the spell using the spell that is on the button. So we click on the button, we have the button right here, it's associated with a spell, and we can take that spell and feed it to the action. Perfect. And now we can go back inside the action CBT cast spell to do the logic. And actually for this action, it's going to combine two actions we already created. So if I go back in my actions in combat setup right here, I have the action cast spell and the action show spell range pattern right here. So the new action is going to combine both of those actions. So I'm going to go pretty fast. So back in the action CBT cast spell, the first thing I'm going to do when we set a spell is to check if the spell is valid. So if we are setting the spell back to none, what do we want to do? Well, we don't want to cast anything. So I'm just going to hide all the spell range that we displayed on the screen, which means that if it's false, I'm just going to clear the states is spell range and also the is spell range AoE. But in the case that the spell is valid, I'm just going to start by getting the data from the spell. I'm just going to do it once at the beginning when we are setting the spell. I'm not going to do it every time we need to access the data of the spells. So that's why I'm doing it here. And actually, I'm going to split the structure and save the spell that I cast and the spell that I cast AoE to some variables. So I have my spell that I cast cast right here on the left, my variable cast, and also my cast AoE right here on the left. So now we can reuse them later on if we need to, which we will. And then the next step is to display the spell range, because right here we just set a new spell, so we want to show which tiles are targetable. So we could just do that right here at the end, but I think it will be cleaner if we just create a new function for it. So I'm just going to create a new function and name it the show spell range pattern, and then go back in the set spell and call this new function at the end after initializing all the variables, and then go back in the function to do the logic. And the first step is to clean up the grid, so we're simply doing a clear state from tile to remove the previous range, and then we can calculate the new range. So to do that, I'm just gonna call the getSpellRange function that is inside the combat system. For the origin index, we're gonna use the selected tile, which is the tile that the unit is on, and then for the cast, we can simply take the variable that we have on the left. So we have our cast variable right here, and that returns us the new spell range. So now we just have to loop through all of them and do add state to tile to add them all on the grid. Perfect, now we have the range visible on the grid, and now the next step is to make sure that when we click on one of those tiles, we cast the spell. So I'm gonna go in my function and override the execute action function, which is happening every time we click on the grid. So here we go. Now we just have to do the logic to cast the spell, which is super simple. We just have to call the cast spell function, passing it the spell, the origin index, which is the selected tile, and then the target index, which is the index we just clicked on. Here we go. Now we're casting the spell. And one last thing before we go back in the game to test all that, I'm gonna override the event end play right here. End play, I'm going to add a call to the parent function as usual, and then what I'm going to do is just clean up the grid once again. So that way, when we destroy the action, we're not going to have any residual state on the grid. So here we go. We're simply going to clear the isSpellRange and SpellRange AoE. Perfect. Now we can compile and go see how it looks in the game. And here it is. So now I have my two units on my grid, and I can select my spells and cast them. I can cast them as many times as I want because we didn't implement the action point system just yet, so we're gonna do that a little bit later. But for now, it's possible to select the spell, cast the spell, move the unit around, select the spell again, cast the spell, hit the other unit, select the other spell, cast the other spell, etc. So it seems to work perfectly good. And now if we end our turn, then the other unit is going to play, and we have more spells that we can cast. And it seems to work fine for that one too. Good. And then if we deselect the spell, we can move around and everything works just fine. Good. But there's a few things we have to fix. First, we have the action point system, which we're not gonna start with. I'm gonna do that a little bit later, but we have that to fix, so keep that in mind. And then the second thing is when we cast a spell, well, it would be nice to deselect the spell because we're not going to be able to cast the same spell multiple times in a row. So we're just going to deselect it every time we cast a spell. And at the same time, just to save a little bit more time in this video, I'm going to combine this with another functionality. I'm going to make that when we click on the numbers on your keyboard, so the number 1 is going to select the first spell, the number 2 is going to select the second spell, and on and on. So we're going to do that at the same time as deselecting the spell when we cast it, because it's just going to be simpler and it's going to save us a bit of time. So when we cast a spell, we deselect it right after, and when we press on numbers on the keyboard, it's going to select the associated spell. Good, let's go do that. I'm gonna stop and go start with the button list because there's no way to set the selected spell right now. So let's go do that. So we need to create ourselves a new function to do that. I named the function setSelectedSpell from index, and I'm passing it one input, which is the index of the spell we want to select. So a new integer right here, I named it index, and I made sure that the default value is -1, because if we feed -1 to this function, we're gonna deselect the current spell, which we're gonna use to deselect the current spell in the game. So that's why I'm doing them both at the same time. So here it is, if we feed it -1, it's going to deselect the spell. So that's why here, when we do the logic, we have to first make sure that the index is greater or equal than 0, meaning that we want to select a valid spell, and to make sure that it is really valid, we want to also make sure that it is smaller than the children count inside the grid panel spell, because we're going to take the grid panel and we're going to associate the index we received with one of the buttons in the grid panel. So that's why we have to compare and make sure that it is part of the buttons, if we have enough buttons in the grid panel to select one of them. So if here it's false, it means that we received an invalid input, and in that case, we're just going to deselect the current button. So I'm just going to do a unspell button clicked, passing it nothing as button. So we're gonna deselect the selected button. But if it's true, it means that the index is probably valid and we want to select the button associated to it. So I'm just going to get the children at the index that we received. So we're gonna take the children inside the grid panel, and then to make sure that it is a valid button, a spell button, I'm just going to cast it to button spell to have access to all the functionalities inside it, but also to be able to call the unspell button clicked right here, passing it the button. So we're gonna select that button. And now we should be able to go use this function to deselect the current spell after casting it. So I'm gonna go back in my action combat spell, go in this execute action function, and right here at the end, after casting the spell, I'm going to deselect it. So I'm gonna call the set selected spell from index, passing it the index -1, which is going to deselect it. This function is inside the button list spell, inside the widget combat, inside the player action. It's pretty far, but it's still accessible, so that's good. So now it's going to deselect the spell after casting it, and the other thing we want to do is to make sure that when the player press on one of the numbers on the keyboard, it selects the associated spells. And to do that, we're gonna go inside the BP player action, because this is where the inputs are made. So I'm gonna go in the event graph. Right here we have the left click and right click, and right under that I'm going to implement another input event, and I'm gonna use the any key event, which is called anytime you're pressing on any keys. It's either on your keyboard or your mouse or even the gamepad, the controller. If you're pressing the button or the joysticks, it's going to call this event. So it's going to really receive any kind of event, and we're going to have to filter out the ones we want. And I think it's the simplest way to filter out all the numbers on our keyboards at the same time without having to create multiple inputs in the input manager, because we will need to create one event for each of our numbers, which we have 10 of them, so that's a lot of numbers and we don't want to do that. So we are going to simply use the any key and filter out the numbers that we want to use. So here it is, I have my any key event. In the top right corner I made sure to uncheck the consume input, because otherwise if you're trying to use the any key event somewhere else in the project, it's not gonna work, so that's why I'm unchecking it. And then for the logic of the event, it's pretty simple. The first thing we're gonna check is, well, if we are in combat, because we don't want to execute any of that logic if we are not in combat. So that's just a simple check. Just make sure that we are in combat, and then we have to filter out the key. We have the key right here that we pressed, so maybe it's the spacebar, maybe it's a letter, maybe it's a number. So to filter them out, we're just going to get the display name of the key, which is going to return us the name of the key, which is going to be either H, L, M, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on what we pressed. So if we pressed a number, this string right here is going to be numeric. So we just have to check, okay, are you numeric? Yes, no. If you are, well, you just press on a number, so that's good, we want to use you. So let's continue the flow. We just have to set the selected spell from the index of the button we just pressed. So in the button spell list, we are calling this function, and then we just need to convert the name of the key to an integer. So I'm just going to convert it, and then before feeding it to my function, I'm just going to do a -1, because the numbers on our keyboard starts at 1. They are doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but the indexes in our spell bar are starting at 0, so it's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if we want them to match together, we have to -1 the index of the key. Here we go. Now we can compile, save, and we should see the result in game. Here we go, so now I have 2 units on my grid, I have my warrior and my slime, and if I try to cast my spell from my warrior, we can see that it unselects the spell once it's casted. So that's good, that's exactly what we want. So I have to go back down and select my spell again to cast it, and if I want to cast it super fast, I can use my numbers on my keyboard, so I can press 1 to cast the spell multiple times, or press 2 to use the second spell, and we can see that it works pretty well. So that's good, that's pretty fine, and I think it also works if I use my slime. So if I use my slime, I can see that I can cast my first spell right here, and then if I click outside of the zone, it unselects the spell, so that's good too. And then if I cast my other spell, we can see that it works properly with my numbers on my keyboard. So that's great, that's working perfectly. There's just one thing though, I don't know if you saw it, but right now if we are trying to cast the slime ball, which is an AoE spell, it doesn't draw the AoE. So let's go do that. I'm gonna stop and go back in the action cast spell. And here let's create a new function to show the spell range pattern AoE. So show spell range pattern AoE right here. And actually, since the logic of the function is exactly the same as the one we did in the previous action, I'm just going to go there and copy paste it. So I'm gonna go in my entry and open the action, select tile and unit, and show spell range pattern. So let's open that one. And I'm gonna go inside the show spell range pattern AoE function. Okay, so it is the one that I have right here. I'm just going to select everything and copy everything from here. So copy everything, go back in the action combat cast spell and paste it. So here it is, I have all my code that is pasted right here. I'm just going to realign it with the beginning of my function and connect it like so. There we go, so now we have the logic and we just have to go call this function, and we have to call it in 2 places. So the first place is when we are hovering a new tile on the grid. So I'm gonna override the execute hovered action function. So here it is, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to reattach the parent obviously, and then I'm just going to call the show spell range pattern AoE. Here we go. Now it's going to re-update the AoE every time we are overing a new tile, so that's good. And the second place is where we are showing the spell range pattern. So after showing the real spell range pattern, so I'm going to go in there, show spell range pattern, and at the beginning of the function, I'm just going to add a little sequence to call the show spell range pattern AoE. So we are displaying the real spell range and then the range AoE if we are already overing a new tile. Perfect. Now we should be able to go in the game and see the result. Here we go, so now I can select my slime, I can move around as usual, and then if I try to cast my slime ball, which is a spell AoE, we can see that now the range AoE is displayed on the screen and I can cast it as many times as I want, but the spell range is still drawn on the grid, so that's great. Okay, good. So that works fine, that's perfect, and now we are able to cast the spell as many times as we want, which is actually a problem because there's no limit. We are not consuming any action point, we're not limiting the amount of times you can cast the spell per turn, so that's not really fair. I can kill anything without any consequences. Yeah, that's not good. So we have to make sure to consume action point every time we are casting the spell. So let's go do that. And to do that, we need to do two things. First, we have to add a cost in action points to all of our spells, so it costs something to cast them, and then we have to give some action points to our units so they are able to cast some spells. So let's start with the cost of our spells. So I'm gonna go in my core combat spells inside the folder utilities and create myself a new structure for the requirements to cast a spell. So blueprints structure, I'm going to name it s_spelldata_requirements, and inside that structure I'm going to rename the default variable to cost_AP, and then I'm going to change the type to an integer. So here it is, I have my new variable to remember how much it's going to cost to cast the spell, and then I'm going to go add that structure inside the spell data structure. So in there I'm going to add a new variable, I'm going to rename it the requirements, and then change the variable type to the requirement structure we just created. So s_spelldata requirements. Here we go. Now we can save and close the s_spelldata, and I'm gonna go in the data table to assign a cost to all of my spells. I left my test spell to 0, and then melee hit 3, sword slash 3, sword throw 3, short range arrow 4, long range arrow 2, dark wave 4, heal 2, slime ball 3, run chicken run 1, and then wind gust 5. Here we go. Now we can save and close the data table. And now we have to do the same thing for the units. We have to give them some action points to spend on the spell. So I'm gonna go in my units, in utilities, and open s_unit data stats. And in there I'm going to add myself two new variables for the action point. The first one is going to be AP_current, so action point current, and the second one is going to be AP_max for the action point maximum. And both of them are going to be integer, and I'm going to change the default value to 6 and 6. So they have 6 action point current and maximum by default. Perfect. Now we can save and close the structure and go inside the units to create some functions to modify them. So I'm gonna go in my BP unit, and in here we're gonna do the same thing we did for the movement point. So I'm going to duplicate all three functions I have right here. So modify current MP, set current MP, and reset MP. And for all these three functions, I'm going to modify them just a little bit, just so they are affecting the action point instead of the movement point. So what did I change in my function? So first I renamed them, so modify current AP, set current AP, and reset AP. Here we go. In the modify current AP, I'm doing the same exact thing, but I'm calling the set current AP right here, and I'm using the AP current right here in the addition. So that's it for the modify. Then for the set current AP, I didn't change much. I'm just using the AP current and AP max right here instead of the MP current and maximum, and then I'm setting the AP current instead of the MP current. Here it is. Everything else is the same here if you want to have a look, but I didn't change anything for the rest of the function, so that's it. And then for the reset AP, it's super simple. We just have to call the set current AP, passing it the AP max. Here it is. So that's it. We're done with the three functions. Actually, that's not true, because if we go back in the set current AP at the end of the function, we are spawning the animated number and we are setting the color to green, but we don't want that. We want to have a new color for the action point. So I'm gonna go back in my entry and I'm gonna go in my units, in the widgets, and inside my animated number color env, I'm going to add myself a new color, which is going to be blue this time for the action point, I'm going to save it, and then I'm gonna go inside my widget animated number to set the color. So I'm gonna go in my graph right here, and here I have my color, which I can just open and set it to a shade of blue. So let's say that one, here we go. So now we have red, green, and blue. I can compile and save the widget animated number, and back in the unit, in my function, I can now select the new color. If you don't see it, you can just refresh the node and it should now appear. Yeah, we can now set it to blue. Perfect. And now the next step will be to make sure to reset the action point every time we are resetting the movement point. So I'm just going to right click on the reset MP and do a find reference, and then I'm gonna go in all those functions to reset my action point. So on combat started, I'm going to reset my action point. On turn ended, I'm going to reset my action point, and then on combat ended, I'm also going to reset my action point. Here it is. Now my action points are now resetted every time we are resetting the movement point. And now, to consume the action point, we have to, every time the unit casts a spell, reduce the amount of current action point. So I'm gonna go in the unit cast spell function, which is where the unit is casting a spell. And right now, we don't really have the information we need. We only know what target index we are targeting, so that's not that useful. We need to know how much the spell is going to cost. So what I'm going to do is just feed another variable to that function, and it is going to be the spell data of the spell we are currently casting. So here it is, a new variable, spell data of type S spell data. It's going to contain all the information we need. Then I'm going to go at the end of the function after doing all that, and I'm going to reduce the amount of current action point the unit has. So I'm just taking the requirements from the spell data and then taking the cost action point, making it negative to subtract from it, and then modify the current AP using the cost of the spell. Here we go. Now we can compile and save the unit, and now we just have to make sure to feed the spell data to that function when we are calling it, and we're calling it inside the combat system. So let's go there. I'm gonna go in entry, combat, and open the BP combat system. And we're gonna go inside the cast spell function, and in there the place we are interested in is this bit right here. This is where we are calling the unit cast spell function, and now we just have to feed the spell data, which I actually just have right here. So I'm going to copy paste it and connect it like so. Here we go. Now we are feeding the spell data to the unit, and it should subtract the action point when we are casting the spell. So let's go see how it looks. Here we go. So now when I cast my spell, we can see that it writes -4 on top of my head because the spell costs 4 action points, so that's good. And then if I'm casting the other spell, we can see that it writes -2. And when I end my turn, it should now resets my action point, so genre +6. Perfect. So it works. We can say it works fine, but I'm still able to cast my spell as many times as I want, and that's not good. It looks like I have like an infinite amount of action points, so that's weird, but actually I don't. It's just that we're never checking to make sure that the unit has enough action point to cast the spell. We're just subtracting from it every time, but we're never checking, okay, are you still able to cast the spell or not? So we have to add that feature. So I'm gonna stop and go in the unit to ask him, okay, do you have enough action point to cast your spell? So I'm gonna add a new function for that. I named the function canCastSpell, and I'm passing it the spell as input, obviously, so we can check if we can cast it or not. So the spell data here as input, and I'm returning a boolean at the end telling us if we can cast the spell or not. Okay, good. So now we're gonna do the logic, and that's how it's gonna go. So the first thing we're gonna check is if the spell that we received as input is part of the available list of spells that are castable by the unit, because not all units are able to cast any spells in the game. So we're just gonna make sure that the spell is part of that list. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to cast that spell. So we can just return false right here. Otherwise, if the spell can be casted by the unit, then we're gonna check if the unit has enough action point to do it. So I'm just gonna go here and create myself a new branch, and this time we're gonna check if we have enough action point, and that's super simple. We just have to make sure that the current amount of action point held by the unit is greater or equal than the cost action point for that specific spell, and that's it. If we have more than that, we can just return true. Otherwise, we are just returning false because we don't have enough action point. Perfect. Now we can compile and save this function and go in the combat system to use it to prevent the unit from casting the spell. And we're gonna do that at the beginning of the function. So I'm gonna go all the way at the beginning, so right here, and I'm going to give myself a bit of space, actually a lot of space, because there's a bit of code that's gonna go in there, and I'm gonna do it like that. So here, right after setting the data of our spells, we now have all the informations we need to ask the unit, okay, can you cast the spell or not? And that's what we're gonna do. But first, I'm gonna check to make sure that there's a unit on the tile. So right here, we're gonna check, okay, is there a unit on that tile? Because if there's there's no unit on the tile, we are probably going to assume that we are in the debug menu and we are just trying our spells here and there. So we don't need to ask the unit, okay, can you cast the spell, because there's no unit on the tile. So that doesn't matter in this case. So that's why if it's not valid, I'm just going to continue the flow as is. That's not an issue. But in the case that there's a unit on the tile, then we're gonna ask it, okay, can you cast the spell, passing it the spell, obviously. And then if it returns false, it means that the unit cannot cast the spell and we don't need to continue the flow. So that's why my false here is not connected to anything, because we're not gonna do anything. The unit cannot cast the spell. But if the unit can cast the spell, well, we can just continue the flow as before. Perfect. So now we should be able to compile, save, and go see how it looks in the game. And here it is. So now I have my unit on my grid and I can cast my spell. It consumed 4 action points, and now if I try to cast it again, we can see that it doesn't work. And now since my unit only has 2 action points left, I can still cast my second spell. So I can cast it because it only costs 2 action points. But I cannot cast it more than that because I don't have any action point left now. So that's good. It works as expected. It's a little bit annoying that I don't have any feedback in which spell I can cast. So we're gonna fix that. And that's the last thing we have to do today. But yeah, we're gonna fix that. And before that, I'm just gonna make sure that if I end my turn and start again, and I can cast my spell a few times, so I can cast it 2, -2, -2. So now I should not have any action point left, and I cannot cast it anymore because I don't have any action point left. So the mechanic works. We just have to make sure that the user interface also prevents us from casting the spell or selecting the spell and trying to cast it on a grid when we can't cast it. So let's go do that. I'm gonna start by going in the BP unit first, and we're gonna add ourselves a new callback that we're gonna use to bind things in the game that are going to react every time the unit stats are going to change. So if the unit lose action point, movement point, health point, or things like that, we're gonna have the possibility to react if we need to. So here it is, on unit stat changed, and I'm passing the unit as input in the callback. So here it is, and now to call it, we're gonna go everywhere we're modifying the stats of the unit. So inside the set current HP, at the end, we are modifying the structure, and after that, we can just call the callback to notify the game. Then inside the set current MP, we're gonna give ourselves a bit of room right after setting the structure, and we're gonna call the callback in the middle, just right here. And finally, inside the set current AP, we're gonna do the same thing. So right after setting the structure, we're gonna call the callback just like that. Here we go. So now we can notify the game every time the stats change. And we're gonna go use this callback inside the button list spell. So right here, inside the function link unit to spell list, that's here where we are going to connect ourselves to that new callback. And the first thing we're gonna do here is select everything that's inside the function and collapse it inside another function. So collapse to function, which I'm gonna name unlinked unit stats changed, which is the function that we're gonna call every time the unit stats change, obviously. So let's do that. I'm gonna call this function, but first I have to bind myself to the callback right here. And that's how it looks. It looks a little bit complicated, but it's not too bad actually. First, let's create ourselves a new variable right here on the left. So I have my linked unit variable, which is of type BP unit, and that's just to keep track of which unit is connected to that spell bar right now. So first in the sequence, the first step is to unbind the previous unit, unlink the previous unit. So that's what I'm doing right here. If the previous unit was valid, I'm just going to unbind event from ununit stat change. So the new callback we created, which is connected to the new function right here that we just created. So ununit stat change, here it is. So we're gonna unbind them. So it's not going to call it anymore with the previous unit because we don't want to refresh for the previous unit, only the current one. So we unbind right here, and then we are setting the new linked unit. And if it is valid, well, we bind to the callback again. So we unbind the previous one and bind to the new one. Here we go. So that's it. Now it should be called every time the unit stat change. And just to be sure to refresh the spell bar at the beginning of the turn. So when we are selecting the unit, we're just going to refresh it right here. If the unit is valid, well, we just have to refresh the spell bar. But in the case that the unit is not valid, because it's possible that we send a unit that is not valid because we don't want to populate the spell bar or thing like that, I'm just going to set a spell list using an array with only one element that contains none. So it's just going to not display anything in this case. We can probably refactor that in the future and make it prettier or clearer that we don't want to display anything. But for now, I think this is going to work, and that's what we're gonna do. So that's good. Now it should call our linked unit stat change function every time the stats changed. And inside that function, it's all the code that we have to refresh the spell bar. But we just need to add a few little things afterwards. But before doing that, we need to add a little feature inside the button spell, because what we want to do is to change the visual of the button spell to show the player that he cannot select that spell anymore because he doesn't have all the requirements to cast that spell. So what we're going to do is go add the possibility in the button spell to modify its visual depending if we can cast it or not. So I'm going to go in my entry, I'm going to go back in my spells, in my widget, and open button spells, and I'm going to go in the graph to add that little feature. And here we're going to keep it super simple. Here on the left we have the isSelected variable. I'm just going to duplicate it to create myself a new boolean which I named can be selected. So if we can select the button or not. I have also made sure that it is still instance editable and exposed on spawn. That way it's going to be simpler for us to assign the values. And then we can check the checkbox just to make sure that it is can be selected by default. So if it's true by default, we can select the button by default and that's what we want. So that's good. Just make sure to check the default value. Then we're going to make the same exact thing we did here for the selected variable, but for the new variable. So let's start by the event. So I have the new event underscore set can be selected, and we're going to use it to set the value of our variables. And then same thing as we did for the selected, we're going to change the visual of the button. But in this case, we're going to change the color and opacity of our spell icon. So what we're going to do is if we can select the button, we're going to keep it white. So completely white, it's going to be bright and visible, but otherwise we're going to make it gray, so a darker shade. That way it's going to make the button darker if we can't select it, which just makes sense. Here is the color if you want to copy it. But yeah, so we're going to change the color of our button, and then I'm just going to call this event in the pre-construct to set the initial state. So right here in the top right, I'm calling the event and can be selected, passing it the variable. Perfect. So now we should be able to compile and go see in the designer how it looks. If I go on my button spell right here and I change the spell icon to any of our spell, and then I can see that my can be selected is checked by default, and if I uncheck it, we can see that the button is now darker and or brighter if it is true. So bright, dark, depending if we can select it or not. Perfect. I'm just going to reset everything, compile the button, and go assign the state of that values inside the button list spell. And to do that, I'm simply going to take my spell list, which we just set right here in the set spell list function, then loop through all the spells in the list and get their data. So we're getting all the spells data one by one. Then with that data, we can ask the linked unit, okay, can you cast that spell? Yes, no, maybe. Can you cast it? And then we just have to feed the can cast, the return of the function, to our button. So to do that, I'm just going to get the child in the grid panel using the array index. And then I'm going to cast it to the button spell, which I know it is a button spell, so that's why the cast is going to work and will give us access to the function inside it. And then we can simply call the set can be selected, just like that. So now the button visual is going to be updated depending if the unit can cast the spell or not. And since this event is called every time the unit stats gets updated, so if the unit consumes any amount of action point and is now not able to cast the spell anymore, the button is going to change automatically. But that's good for the visual, but there's nothing preventing the player to select the spell still, even if there's a variable in it saying that it cannot be selected, we can still select the spell. But now what we're going to do is just prevent the player to select it by going inside the event graph and going where we are clicking on the button. So here we are clicking on the button, on spell button clicked, we click on the button, and then before selecting it at the end, we're just gonna make sure that we can still select that button. So here it is, I have my button and we want to check if we can select it. So I'm just going to add a branch right before setting it to selected. For the condition, I'm gonna use the can be selected condition coming from the button. So with the button, can I select it? Yes, no. If I can, I'm just going to mark it as selected as usual, but otherwise I'm just going to cancel my selected button just like that. So I'm going to set it back to nothing. Here we go. So now the player should not be able to select the button anymore. Perfect. And now just one last little quick thing before ending today's video. Right now we have a bug inside one of our previous actions. So in the action cast spell that we were using outside of combat, so the one that we were using with the debug menu, I'm just gonna go in it. So in player action, in combat setup, we have the action cast spell right here. And when we execute the action, we are casting the spell, which is fine. But right now, this is consuming action point now. So after a few spells, the unit is not going to be able to cast any more spells. So if we want to continue using this action inside the debug menu and try all of our spells and multiple times each spells and everything, we have to reset the action point of our unit. So that's what we're going to do. If there's a unit on the tile that is casting the spell, we're just going to reset his action point after casting the spell. So that's pretty much the same thing we did with the movement point in the previous video. So after moving the unit, we were resetting the movement point. Now we're doing the same thing with the action point. Perfect. Now we can compile, save, and that should end today's video. There we go, so now we have the units on the grid. Same thing as the previous video, we are still able to move the units around, but this time we are also able to cast spell. They are consuming action points, so it limits the amount of spell the unit can cast during the turn, but then at the end of the turn it's going to reset and we can now continue to the next unit, cast its spell, and go on and go on and go on. That's good, now the game starts to look like something. Great, okay, so that's gonna be it for today's video and I'm gonna see you in the next one, so bye bye!